Imagine going to sleep on a crisp, Thursday night in October. You finish your work, you bank the fire, you go to bed thinking about the chores you have to do tomorrow and Friday, October 5th.
Right.
But when you wake up the very next morning, the calendar on the wall, the government, the church, everyone just agrees that it is suddenly Friday, October 15th.
It's wild to think about.
10 entire days of your life, your rent cycle, your history, just deleted, evaporated by a papal decree, essentially, to fix a math equation.
It is honestly one of the most surreal moments in recorded human history, like the ultimate clerical correction.
Yeah.
And what is truly remarkable is that we are still feeling the shockwaves of that missing block of time centuries later.
That 1582 time jump is, it's the perfect entry point into what we are doing today. Because normally when you look at a calendar, there is this expectation of bedrock precision.
Sure, yeah, like the 4th of July.
Exactly. A holiday like the 4th of July or Valentine's Day sits in its box, anchored to a specific date, completely immovable. But then you step into the world of springtime religious holidays, specifically Easter and Passover, and suddenly that predictable calendar just shatters into a million pieces.
Oh, absolutely.
Have you ever wondered why some holidays are the same day every year, while Easter bounces around the spring months like a pinball?
It is the absolute definition of chronological muddy waters. We are dealing with an intersection of astronomy, deep theology, and imperial politics that has been brewing for, well, thousands of years.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking you on a fascinating mission. We are unraveling the centuries-old calendar clash between Easter and Passover.
It's a tangled web.
It really is. We've got a stack of incredible sources today that trace this lineage all the way back to the ancient world. Our goal is to figure out why the dates for these deeply connected holidays are so seemingly chaotic, especially when we look at the current year we are sitting in, 2026.
Yes, 2026 is a prime example.
Okay, let's unpack this. Set the stage for us chronologically. If we look at the calendar today, what exactly just happened?
So to really grasp the confusion, we just have to look at the timeline of the past 2 weeks.
Okay.
Today is Monday, April 13th, 2026. If we look back, the Western Easter, meaning the celebration observed by the Catholic and Protestant churches, occurred over a week ago on April 5th.
Right.
Following that, the Jewish festival of Passover just ended a few days ago on April 9th. And then Eastern, or Orthodox Easter, was celebrated just yesterday on April 12th.
Wait, so we have a major Western Christian holiday, a massive 8-day Jewish festival, and a major Eastern Christian holiday, all happening in this staggered, overlapping pileup within a span of roughly 10 days.
Exactly. Let's break down the mechanics of those 2026 dates from the source material a bit more carefully, because the overlap is it's highly specific.
Lay it on me.
Passover began on the evening of April 1st and ran through nightfall on April 9th. Catholic Easter fell on April 5th.
Right in the middle.
Yep, and Orthodox Easter fell on April 12th.
So Catholic Easter landed squarely in the middle of the Passover festival, but Orthodox Easter waited.
It did.
It held off until 3 days after Passover had completely finished. It's like, I don't know, we have 3 friends trying to coordinate a dinner party. One friend is wearing a highly calibrated atomic watch. Another is measuring shadows on a sundial, and the third is just staring up at the moon, waiting for a signal.
That's a great analogy. They are literally operating on 3 distinct astronomical clocks.
Okay, let's go through them. What's the first clock?
The first clock is the Jewish calendar, which is a highly sophisticated lunar solar system. This system is trying to harmonize 2 celestial bodies that, frankly, do not naturally sync up.
The sun and the moon.
Right. A purely lunar year, 12 cycles of the moon, is roughly 354 days long.
Okay.
But a solar year is roughly 365 days.
So that leaves an 11-day gap every single year.
Exactly.
If you just followed the moon, your holidays would slide backward through the seasons. You'd eventually be celebrating a spring harvest festival in the dead of winter.
And to prevent that seasonal drift, the Jewish calendar employs what is known as the Metonic cycle.
The Metonic cycle.
Okay. Yeah, ancient astronomers figured out that 19 solar years are almost exactly equal to 235 lunar months.
Wow, they figured that out without telescopes.
It's incredible, right? So, to keep everything anchored to the spring agricultural season, the Jewish calendar adds a leap month.
Wait, a leap month, not a leap day.
An entire extra 29 or 30 days. They do this 7 times within every 19-year cycle.
That is a massive structural adjustment. It's not just tacking on a single leap day at the end of February like we do. You are inserting a whole new month into the year.
You have to. It keeps the festivals in their proper agricultural seasons, which was vital because Passover requires the offering of the spring barley harvest.
Ah, okay, so it's tied to the actual crop.
Very much so. Then you have the second clock, which is the Gregorian calendar,
The one most of us use today.
right, the standard civil calendar
Okay.
introduced by the Catholic Church. It relies on a purely solar calculation for the year. But to calculate Easter, it uses a fixed mathematical table to estimate the phases of the moon.
So it's completely separate from physical observation of the sky.
Exactly. It's all on paper.
Yeah.
And then the third clock is the Julian calendar.
Okay, the Orthodox clock.
The older system used by the Orthodox Church. It is a solar calendar too, but as we'll get into later, it is slower.
Slower. Okay, I'm keeping that in mind.
And it uses an entirely different mathematical formula to calculate the lunar cycle.
So you mix a lunar solar system that periodically adds whole months, a modern solar system with fixed lunar tables, and an ancient, slower solar system.
It's a recipe for chaos.
The staggered dates of 2026 are literally the mathematical debris of these three systems colliding.
That's exactly what they are.
Mechanical complexity of those three clocks is staggering. But I have to push back on the premise here.
Sure.
From a purely historical standpoint, the Last Supper was a Passover meal.
Yes.
The crucifixion and the resurrection are inextricably linked to the timeline of that specific Jewish festival. Since the roots are entirely intertwined, why wouldn't the early church just stay on the exact same timeline?
It's a logical question.
Right, like if the event happened during Passover, why build two separate competing clocks to track it?
Well, what's fascinating here is how the leap month problem of the Jewish calendar, the one we just talked about, forced the issue.
Oh, really? How so?
As we noted, to keep the lunar calendar aligned with the solar seasons, that extra month called Adar II is added periodically.
Right.
When this leap month happens, it essentially hits the pause button on the spring festivals, pushing the celebration of Passover entire month later into the spring.
So the month of Nisan, which is when Passover happens, just gets delayed.
Exactly. Now consider the Catholic system. It relies on a strict mathematical projection of the spring equinox and the subsequent full moon.
The paper calculations.
Right. It does not recognize the insertion of the Jewish leap month. So you end up in this bizarre scenario where the Catholic clock dictates that spring has arrived, the full moon is here, and it is time for Easter.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Meanwhile, the Jewish clock says, wait, we're in the intercalary leap month. Passover isn't for another 4 weeks.
Wow. So you end up with Catholic Easter happening a full month before Passover even begins?
Yes.
The commemoration of the resurrection occurring weeks before the historical anniversary of the Last Supper. That is, it requires a massive conceptual leap to accept that.
It does. But put yourself in the mindset of ancient peoples trying to build these systems. There were no digital alerts, no standardized global time zones.
Right. You couldn't just check your phone.
In the ancient Jewish world, determining the start of the month required the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem to physically observe the sliver of the new moon.
They had to actually see it.
Yes, they would then light signal fires on the Mount of Olives, which would be seen and repeated on neighboring peaks, passing the message across the diaspora.
A physical chain of fire across the mountains just to let people know the calendar had advanced. That is so cinematic.
It really is.
Yeah.
And deciding on the leap month required agricultural observation. They had to inspect the barley crops to see if they were ripe enough for the Passover offering, the Aviv.
Okay.
And they had to check if the roads were dry enough for pilgrims to travel to Jerusalem.
Wow. So weather and infrastructure dictated the calendar.
If the physical conditions weren't right, they delayed the year.
So for the early Christian communities spreading across the Roman Empire, relying on physical crop inspections and signal fires coming out of Judea to know when to celebrate their most sacred holiday, that just became a logistical impossibility.
Precisely. They needed a system they could predict and control.
That answers the practical side of why they couldn't just sync up perfectly. But looking at our sources, there were actually factions in the early church who rejected that practical separation entirely.
Oh, definitely.
They clung to the Jewish calendar no matter how difficult it was to track.
Yes. In the very early years of the church, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean, a highly significant portion of Christians did exactly what you initially suggested. They tied their observation directly to the literal Jewish timeline.
These were the 14 Defers.
Yes,
Yeah.
the formal term is quartodecimanism, from the Latin word for 14.
Okay.
This was the dominant practice of the earliest Christians in places like Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey and Syria, during the 1st and 2nd centuries,
And according to the historical records in our sources, these communities trace their lineage directly back to the Apostle John.
which carries immense theological weight.
Absolutely. The Gospel of John is incredibly specific about the timeline, emphasizing that Jesus was crucified on the exact day and at the exact time the Passover lambs were being slaughtered in the temple.
Right.
For these communities, that historical synchronization wasn't a metaphor, it was the entire point.
They navigated their connection to Passover without any abstraction. They would fast while the Jewish community prepared for Passover. And then they would break their fast and celebrate the Eucharist and the resurrection precisely on the 14th day of the Jewish month of Nisan, the day of the Passover preparation.
So for the Quartodecimans, the calendar date was absolute, the 14th of Nisan.
Unshakable.
It didn't matter what day of the week it happened to fall on. If the 14th of Nisan was a Tuesday, then Pascha, their celebration of Easter, was on a Tuesday.
Correct.
If it was a Thursday, they celebrated on a Thursday. They were directly linking their celebration to the Passover lamb, anchoring it to the exact Jewish date.
Because the historical anchor carried the theological weight. For them, the celebration was a singular, unified commemoration of the entire mystery of the Passion.
The suffering, the death, and the resurrection.
All of it, encapsulated in that specific lunar date. It was deeply embedded in the rhythm of the Jewish calendar.
So what does this all mean? If this practice was so direct, so historically grounded, and championed by communities tied to one of the original apostles, why did it trigger one of the first major crises in church history?
Well, as the movement expanded beyond its Judeo-centric roots into the broader Greco-Roman world, different regions developed fundamentally different theological priorities.
Okay, so a culture clash.
Very much so. While the communities in Asia Minor insisted on the literal date of the 14th, other major hubs, primarily in Rome and Alexandria, insisted on the primacy of the day of the week.
Because the resurrection historically occurred on a Sunday.
Right, the first day of the week. They argued the celebration must always, without exception, fall on a Sunday.
So for the Gentile converts in Rome, the numerical date of the Jewish month held way less cultural significance than the symbolic power of Sunday.
Exactly.
Every Sunday was already a mini Easter for them, the day they gathered to commemorate the empty tomb.
So by the mid-2nd century, this disagreement escalated into what history calls the Paschal controversy. You had the East operating on a lunar numerical date and the West operating on a solar weekly cycle.
And it set up a massive showdown in 155 AD between two towering figures.
It really did.
You had Polycarp, the revered bishop of Smyrna, a disciple of John, and an uncompromising 14ther.
Yeah.
And he actually traveled all the way to Rome to meet face-to-face with Pope Anicetus, who represented the Sunday-only tradition. The stakes of this meeting are just incredible.
They were massive.
Two influential leaders representing vastly different cultural backgrounds sitting down to hammer out a unified calendar for a rapidly growing, persecuted religious movement. What happened?
Well, they debated fiercely. Polycarp cited the authority of the Apostle John and the ancient tradition of the East.
Right.
Anicetus cited the authority of the presbyters before him in Rome and the theological necessity of the Sunday resurrection. Ultimately, neither man would yield. They reached an absolute theological stalemate on the calendar math. But the profound takeaway from the source material is the resolution of that meeting.
Right.
Despite this massive logistical disagreement over the climax of their liturgical year, they chose to remain in communion. They participated in the Eucharist together and parted in peace.
It is a breathtaking moment of religious tolerance. They essentially decided that the unity of their shared belief was more important than synchronized scheduling.
It's beautiful, really.
It is. But if you think about the real-world implications of that peaceful disagreement, it must have been a chaotic nightmare for the average person.
Oh, logistically, it was a mess.
Imagine an early Christian merchant traveling the trade routes across the Mediterranean. You leave Rome, where everyone is gearing up for a Sunday celebration.
Okay.
You arrive in a city in Syria, and they're celebrating the holiest day of the year on a Wednesday because it happens to be the 14th of Nisan.
Right.
You'd never know when the holidays were happening unless you asked the locals which calendar system they subscribed to.
For the first 300 years of Christian history, the timing was entirely fractured like that. The agreed to disagree peace of 155 AD was a beautiful theological moment, but structurally, it was unsustainable.
It just couldn't hold up.
No. As the church grew from a persecuted minority into a massive institution, Having half the population feasting, while the other half was strictly fasting, undermined the visible unity of the movement.
The organization got too big. You can't run a sprawling empire where neighboring provinces are observing the most important civic and religious holidays on completely different weeks.
You really can't.
So the structural tension finally snapped in the 4th century, leading to the ultimate scheduling summit, the Council of Nicaea.
Yes, in 325 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea. He had recently consolidated power over the entire Roman Empire and wanted a unified church to act as the spiritual glue for his realm.
And a messy, fractured calendar was a political liability.
Exactly. One of the council's major mandates was a massive standardization effort. They officially mandated the shift to an annual Sunday event for the entire Christian world,
Effectively severing the calculation of Easter from the Jewish observation of Passover.
definitively severing it.
The sources reveal a fascinating and frankly quite tense set of motivations behind this split. It wasn't just a matter of convenience. There was a strong desire for self-reliance.
Very true.
As you mentioned earlier, the church didn't want to wait for physical signifiers from Judea to know when to celebrate. They wanted their own mathematical formula.
The Jewish diaspora had expanded, and the Sanhedrin's ability to communicate the calendar effectively had been severely compromised following the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD.
So the communication lines were broken anyway.
Right. The Christians in the Roman Empire wanted an independent, mathematically predictable way to calculate the spring full moon without relying on a system they viewed as increasingly decentralized.
But looking at the text from Nicaea, there is a darker undercurrent here too. This wasn't merely an administrative upgrade.
No, it was highly political.
The Roman Empire was actively trying to construct a unique Christian identity that was legally and culturally distinct from Judaism. The rhetoric from Constantine himself was heavily anti-Judaizing.
Yes, the sources show some very harsh language.
Moving the celebration away from the 14th of Nisan was a deliberate political mechanism to create cultural separation.
The socio-political climate heavily influenced the theology. Nicaea formalized a new mechanism. They declared Easter was to be celebrated on the first Sunday, after the first full moon, following the spring equinox.
The first Sunday after the first full moon, after the spring equinox.
Okay, this formula was a brilliant piece of diplomatic engineering, honestly. It preserved a connection to the season of Passover through the requirement of the full moon.
Ensuring Easter remained a spring festival.
Right, but it guaranteed the celebration would unconditionally land on a Sunday, satisfying the Roman and Alexandrian traditions.
It feels like the early church took a massive ship and just cut the anchor line. They decided to construct their own navigational system rather than remaining tethered to the Jewish authorities.
That's a good way to look at it.
But implementing this new rule required serious astronomical heavy lifting. How did they actually project this without modern technology?
They turned to the scholars of Alexandria in Egypt, who were the foremost astronomers of the ancient world.
Okay, the experts.
The Alexandrians developed a set of complex mathematical tables used to calculate the dates of the full moon for years in advance.
Wow.
They used something called epochs, which mathematically indicated the age of the moon on January 1st of any given year.
The age of the moon.
Basically what phase it was in on day 1 of the year. By tracking these epochs through that 19-year metonic cycle we talked about, they could predict the lunar phases with astonishing accuracy.
Completely bypassing the need for anyone to stand on a mountain and look at the sky.
Exactly.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Nicaea didn't just impose a new math problem, it entirely rewired the liturgical experience of time.
It profoundly changed it.
The Quartodecimans experienced a literal date-based focus. If the crucifixion happened on the 14th, you mourned on the 14th.
Right.
But by moving permanently to a Sunday, the church developed the Paschal Triduum.
Yes, they moved from a single day of observance to a thematic 3-day liturgical arc. Day 1 is Thursday evening to Friday evening, marking the Last Supper and the crucifixion.
Okay.
Day 2 is Friday evening to Saturday evening, the quiet of the tomb. And day 3 is Saturday evening into Sunday morning, marking the resurrection.
So it stopped being a historical stopwatch and became a theological journey.
Exactly.
The symbolism of that Sunday anchor is profound. In ancient Christian theology, God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh, the Saturday Sabbath.
Yes.
By placing the resurrection unconditionally on Sunday, the day after the Sabbath, it became known as the 8th day.
The 8th day.
It wasn't just the start of a new week. It symbolized a rupture in time itself, a new creation. Nicaea successfully standardized this eighth-day tradition across the empire.
And as a result, the quarter-decimans were gradually marginalized and phased out.
Nicaea solved the theological and political disagreement by forcing everyone onto the exact same calendar framework, the Julian calendar.
They achieved the visible unity Constantine desired. The formula was set, the Alexandrian astronomers provided the math, and the Julian calendar provided the grid. It seemed like the perfect, permanent solution.
But the sources revealed the fatal flaw in the plan.
Oh, yes.
At Nicaea in 325 AD, they didn't realize they had a massive astronomical bomb ticking away quietly in the background of the Julian calendar itself.
The Julian calendar, which was implemented by Julius Caesar back in 46 BC, was considered the absolute pinnacle of timekeeping.
Or its time, sure.
It calculated the solar year, the time it takes the Earth to complete one full orbit around the Sun, as exactly 365.25 days.
365 and a quarter days.
Right. That elegant quarter-day fraction is why we have a leap year every 4 years.
It's it's easy to remember, but it's wrong.
It is slightly imperceptibly wrong. The actual astronomical solar year is roughly 365.2422 days.
Okay, what does that mean in plain English?
In practical terms, the Julian calendar year is about 11 minutes and 14 seconds longer than the actual solar year.
11 minutes, spread across 365 days. It is practically a rounding error.
Right.
It's the equivalent of hitting the snooze button once over the course of an entire year.
And for a single human lifetime, it is entirely meaningless. You'd never notice. But calendars are built to outlast empires.
True.
Over centuries, those 11 minutes accumulate with ruthless mathematical precision. Because the calendar year was artificially longer than the actual solar year, the dates in the calendar began to fall behind the physical position of the Earth in relation to the Sun.
So it's drifting.
Every 128 years, that 11-minute discrepancy compounded into one full day of drift.
Wait, so every century and a quarter, the date written on a piece of parchment is one day out of sync with the actual equinox happening in the sky.
Yes. Let's trace that drift. At the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, the spring equinox, the crucial starting block for the Easter calculation, fell on March 21st.
Okay.
The church locked that date in. But fast forward 1,000 years. By the late 16th century, the Julian calendar had been running with this 11-minute flaw for over a millennia. Oh boy. By the 1580s, the calendar was 10 days out of sync with the solar seasons.
10 days. The calendar said it was March 21st, but astronomically, the Earth had passed the equinox 10 days earlier.
It was a crisis of monumental proportions for the church. The entire Nicene formula, the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox, was disintegrating.
Because if the equinox is drifting, the full moon calculation is wrong.
Exactly. And if the full moon is wrong, Easter lands on the wrong Sunday. The scholars realized that if left uncorrected, the calendar would just keep sliding.
Into the summer.
Easter would drift into the summer, and eventually, centuries down the line, it would be celebrated in the dead of winter.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because you have this slow-motion astronomical train wreck unfolding over centuries. Finally, Pope Gregory XIII decides he has to stop the slide.
He steps in.
In 1582, he introduces the Gregorian calendar. He brings in astronomers to tweak the leap year math, skipping leap years on century marks unless they're divisible by 400.
Right, so this drift won't happen again.
But stopping the future drift doesn't fix the 10 days of time that have already been lost.
No, it doesn't.
To reset the clock, he has to do something completely radical.
He issued a papal bull, Inter Gravissimus, that initiated a literal time jump. He decreed that in October of 1582, the world would simply delete 10 days from existence.
It is hard to overstate the psychological impact of that. People went to sleep on Thursday, October 4th, and woke up the next morning, and it was Friday, October 15th.
Just poof. Gone.
I just try to imagine the genuine, on-the-ground chaos of that moment. Think about contract law.
Oh, sure.
Imagine you have a loan due on October 10th. Does it come due the moment you wake up on the 15th, making you instantly delinquent?
Or do you prorate the interest for the 10 days that technically never happened?
Right. What if your birthday was October 10th? Did you just skip a year of your life? The administrative and legal confusion must have been overwhelming.
The transition was incredibly disruptive. There were riots in some European cities because laborers believed landlords were robbing them of a week and a half's wages.
Oh, I bet. You owe me for the whole month.
Exactly. But mathematically, it was a necessary shock to the system. It snapped the calendar back into alignment with the sun, ensuring that the spring equinox would land precisely back on March 21st.
exactly as it had during the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD.
Right.
The Catholic countries, and eventually the Protestant countries, though they dragged their feet for a while, adopted the new Gregorian calendar because the science was undeniable. It fixed the 11-minute flaw.
Yes.
But this is where the story of a unified calendar breaks entirely, because the East refused to jump.
The Orthodox Church, centered largely in Constantinople and the East, categorically rejected the Gregorian calendar.
Why, if the math was right?
To understand why, you cannot just look at the math. You have to look at the geopolitical context of 1582.
Right. Tensions between the Pope in Rome and the patriarchs in the East were already at a boiling point.
Very much so.
The Great Schism of 1054 had fractured the church structurally. You had the historical trauma of the Crusades, where Western armies sacked Constantinople.
There was deep, entrenched suspicion of anything coming out of Rome.
So from the perspective of the East, this new calendar wasn't an objective scientific update.
Not at all. It was a brazen Roman Catholic innovation.
Mm-hmm.
They viewed Pope Gregory's decree as a unilateral overreach, an attempt to alter the sacred ancient traditions established by the Unified Council of Nicaea without consulting the rest of the Christian world.
The East essentially said, we do not recognize your authority to delete time.
Exactly. They prioritized fidelity to the ancient unified tradition over the new mathematical precision of the West. They decided to remain on the Julian calendar.
And that exact moment in 1582 is where the unified calendar of Nicaea permanently bifurcates.
Yes.
The West jumped ahead to stay synced with the sun. The East stayed behind to guard the tradition.
And because the Orthodox Church stayed on the Julian calendar, that 11-minute flaw didn't magically disappear.
Right.
It is still ticking away right now as we speak, which means the gap between the two calendars is still actively widening.
That is the modern mathematical reality that leads to the staggered dates we experience today. In 1582, the gap was 10 days.
Yes.
Today, in 2026, the gap has expanded to 13 days. When we cross into the year 2100, the Julian calendar will drop another day, and the gap will become 14 days.
So when the Catholic calendar dictates that the spring equinox has arrived on March 21st, the Orthodox Church agrees that the equinox should be March 21st.
Okay.
But because their calendar is 13 days slower, their March 21st doesn't actually arrive until our modern wall calendars read April 3rd.
I see.
That 13-day drift guarantees that the two traditions are looking for the full moon starting from completely different baselines.
The West calculates the first full moon after March 21st. The East calculates the first full moon after their March 21st, which is our April 3rd.
Exactly.
If a full moon happens to fall in that 13-day gap between the two equinox dates, the West will celebrate Easter immediately. The East, however, will consider that full moon to have arrived before their equinox, meaning they have to wait an entire lunar cycle, almost a full month, for the next full moon to arrive before they can celebrate.
That is the math behind it.
That brilliantly explains the math. The 11-minute drift splits the equinox, which splits the lunar calculation, which ultimately splits the Sunday of celebration.
Right.
But that astronomical drift doesn't fully explain the specific quirk of Orthodox Easter we saw this year in 2026.
No, it doesn't.
Catholic Easter was April 5th, landing right in the middle of the Jewish Passover. But Orthodox Easter was April 12th, exactly 3 days after Passover ended.
Yes.
There is another layer of rules at play here beyond just the 13-day gap, isn't there?
There is. The astronomy only gets you halfway there. In the Orthodox tradition, there's an absolute, non-negotiable theological requirement known as the Zonaras rule.
The Zonaras rule, named after who?
Named after a 12th century Byzantine canonist.
Okay, what does the rule dictate?
It dictates that Orthodox Easter cannot, under any circumstances, be celebrated before or during the Jewish festival Passover.
Really?
If the lunar calculations place Easter on a Sunday that overlaps with Passover, the Orthodox Church will intentionally delay their celebration to the following Sunday.
Which is precisely what the Catholic Church ignored this year by celebrating on April 5th, right in the thick of the Jewish festival.
Yes.
Why is the Orthodox Church so adamant about waiting for Passover to clear the calendar?
It is rooted deeply in the theology of salvation history.
Okay, unpack that.
In Christian theology, the Jewish Passover is viewed as the Old Covenant. The historical preparation, the shadow of things to come, the liberation from Egypt.
Right.
Easter is viewed as the New Covenant, the ultimate fulfillment, the resurrection of Christ, as the definitive Paschal Lamb.
So there's an order to things.
Exactly. The Orthodox maintain that the timeline of the liturgy must reflect the timeline of history. The New Covenant logically and theologically, must follow the Old Covenant.
You cannot celebrate the fulfillment before the historical preparation is complete.
Exactly.
If Jesus is the ultimate Passover lamb, the Passover festival itself must happen first to set the stage.
Yes. This is why Orthodox Easter fell on April 12th this year. They watched the Jewish festival run its course from April 1st to April 9th.
And only then.
Only after the Old Covenant festival had entirely concluded could they celebrate the New Covenant resurrection. It preserves the narrative sequence of the biblical text.
I have to admit, standing back and looking at the sheer complexity of this architecture, I mean, the 19-year metonic cycles, the epochs calculating the moon without looking at the sky, an 11-minute mathematical drift that caused a pope to delete 10 days of history.
Geopolitical schisms.
Geopolitical schisms.
Yeah.
The Zonara's rule protecting salvation timelines. It is exhausting.
It is a lot to wrap your head around.
I love the historical weight of it, but practically speaking, it is wildly complicated. It brings up a very modern, pragmatic question that was heavily debated in our source material. Given all this friction, wouldn't it just be infinitely easier if all Christians globally just picked a fixed Sunday?
Yes.
Say the second Sunday of April. Just peg it to the Gregorian calendar, print it on the wall like the 4th of July, and be done with the lunar cycles entirely.
This raises an important question, and it is an argument that gains traction every few decades in ecumenical circles.
I'm not surprised.
It is the ultimate appeal to modern efficiency and administrative unity. But you have to ask, what is the cost of that convenience? What do you lose when you trade ancient cosmic rhythm for a predictable slot on a spreadsheet?
You mean severing the tie to the moon?
If you fix the date to a random modern Sunday, you completely sever the holiday from its ancient biblical roots.
How so?
The events of the Passion were intimately physically tied to the lunar cycle. The bright full moon of Nisan, illuminating the olive trees in the Garden of Gethsemane during Passover, is a historical, physical reality of the narrative.
That's a beautiful image.
The complex formulas developed at Nicaea, despite their flaws, were a desperate attempt to preserve that connection to the cosmos, to ensure that the modern believer was experiencing the same physical sky, the same lunar gravity, as the early church.
The moon is a bridge to the ancient world. By fixing it to a printed solar calendar, you lose the poetry of the heavens. You domesticate the holiday.
You do. But conversely, what if we went the other direction?
Okay, what do you mean?
What if we abandoned the Sunday requirement and just went back to the quartodecimans? Just find the literal 14th of Nisan, add 3 days, and celebrate a historically precise Easter.
Oh, I see. But the sources show the problem with that, too.
They do.
Returning to that original biblical countdown means Easter would fall on completely random weekdays. You might celebrate the resurrection on a Tuesday one year and a Thursday the next.
And you lose Nicaea's profound theology of the 8th day.
Right. The symbolic power of the Lord's Day, the Sunday empty tomb.
Every potential solution, the lunar formula, the fixed Sunday, the literal numerical date, prioritizes one theological or historical value while sacrificing another.
You can have astronomical accuracy, or you can have ancient tradition, or you can have modern convenience, but you cannot have all three.
That structural tension is why the calendar clash remains beautifully, stubbornly unresolved.
It is incredible to think about the layers of history we've excavated today. I mean, we started with those ancient 14 Crithers in the 1st century, breaking their fast on the literal 14th of Nisan, deeply tethered to the Jewish roots of the faith.
Yes.
We watched the Council of Nicaea sever that tie, standardizing the Roman world onto a Sunday schedule to build a distinct identity and solve a logistical nightmare.
Right.
We discovered that an 11-minute astronomical flaw in Julius Caesar's calendar quietly broke the math of the empire, forcing Pope Gregory to literally jump through time in 1582.
Which is still crazy to think about.
And we saw how the geopolitical suspicion of the East caused them to reject that jump, leading straight to the fractured 13-day gap we are experiencing right now in April 2026.
It's quite the journey.
It makes you realize that a simple date printed in a little square on your calendar contains the ghosts of ancient debates, imperial politics, and celestial mechanics.
It is a testament to how deeply humanity cares about orienting itself in time. And I want to leave you with one final fascinating thought based purely on extrapolating the math of the Julian calendar we've discussed today.
I love it. What is it?
We know the Julian calendar loses one full day every 128 years.
Right?
We know that by the year 2100, the 13-day gap will become a 14-day gap.
Yep.
Because the Orthodox Church remains steadfast in using this older calendar for their liturgical cycle, refusing the Gregorian leap year corrections, their calendar will keep drifting endlessly forward against the solar seasons.
The 11-minute flaw is relentless.
Relentless.
Hmm.
Which means if this structural reality continues for thousands of years, the Orthodox calendar will continue to fall further and further behind the actual position of the sun.
Oh, wow.
Eventually, the Julian spring equinox, their starting point for calculating Easter, will drift into what we consider the summer months.
Right.
And centuries after that, it will drift into autumn and eventually into the snows of winter.
That's wild.
Will a future generation of the church, millennia from now, be forced to convene a new council, to have this exact same agonizing debate all over again, just to prevent Easter from turning into a Christmas-time holiday?
A winter Easter. That is a wild, mind-bending thought to end on. You know, we started this whole conversation talking about how we want our calendars to be fixed, predictable, like a pendulum.
Yeah.
But the reality is time and how we choose to measure it is still bouncing around like a pinball machine.
It really is.
The next time you step outside at night, look up at the moon. It's not just a rock in the sky. It is an ancient clock. And for thousands of years, empires, popes, and astronomers have been arguing over how to read it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking up, and we'll catch you next time.